It was a warm Saturday afternoon, the kind where the sunlight hangs lazily over the rooftops and the entire neighborhood seems suspended in a predictable rhythm of lawnmowers humming, sprinklers ticking, and distant laughter drifting from backyard barbecues. And I remember pulling my car slowly onto my street after spending nearly 2 hours at the hardware store gathering supplies for a long overdue deck repair project, mentally planning how I would unload the lumber, organize the tools, and maybe even finish before sunset. But that sense of productive anticipation dissolved almost instantly when I noticed a silver SUV parked squarely in the center of my driveway as if it had every legal and moral right to be there, blocking access completely and forcing me to stop in the middle of the road while I tried to process the simple but baffling reality that someone had chosen my property as their temporary parking solution. At first, I assumed it was a delivery driver who had stepped away momentarily, perhaps dropping off a package at one of the neighboring houses. So I pulled over along the curb and waited patiently inside my car, telling myself that this would resolve itself in a minute or two because surely no one intentionally parks in a stranger's driveway without permission. But as 5 minutes stretched into 10 and no one appeared to claim the vehicle, irritation began to creep in, not explosive anger, but that slow-building frustration that comes when someone's casual disregard disrupts your routine without warning or apology. I stepped out of my car and walked up the driveway to inspect the SUV more closely, noticing that the engine was off and the windows were slightly tinted, offering no clue as to who the owner might be. And that was when I saw her standing across the street on my neighbor's front lawn, talking animatedly to another woman, gesturing with expressive hands, and occasionally glancing in my direction. And although I had only seen her in passing before, I recognized her as someone who had moved into the neighborhood a few months prior. The type of person who always seemed impeccably styled even during casual outings and carried herself with an air of unwavering self-assurance that bordered on territorial authority. I walked across the street calmly, careful to keep my expression neutral and my posture relaxed because I have always believed that tone sets the trajectory of any interaction, and I said politely, "Excuse me, is that your SUV parked in my driveway?" expecting a quick acknowledgement followed by an apology and a short walk to move the vehicle. But instead she turned toward me with an immediate defensiveness that felt disproportionate to the situation, her eyebrows arching sharply as if my question itself was an accusation, rather than a request for clarification. "Yes, it is," she replied curtly, folding her arms across her chest, and the brevity of her response suggested that she did not view this as a problem requiring resolution. "I was hoping you could move it," I continued evenly, gesturing back toward my house. "I just got home and need to unload some materials." She exhaled loudly, glancing toward the SUV as though it were an extension of her personal territory. "I'm just visiting my friend," she said. "It'll only be a few minutes." "I understand," I replied, maintaining my composure. "But I need access to my driveway now." What should have been a straightforward exchange suddenly shifted in tone as her expression hardened, and she said, "You don't have to be so aggressive," even though my voice had remained steady and controlled throughout the conversation. And in that moment I realized that she had already framed the interaction as a confrontation in her mind, casting herself as the victim of hostility rather than the instigator of inconvenience. "I'm not being aggressive," I said calmly. "I'm asking you to move your car from my property." Instead of walking toward the SUV, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone with a dramatic flourish, holding it at chest level as though presenting evidence. "If you keep harassing me, I'll call the police," she warned, her tone infused with self-righteous certainty. The threat caught me off guard not because I feared legal consequences, but because of the sheer absurdity of escalating a simple property dispute into an emergency call. And I responded carefully, "I'm not harassing you. I'm asking you to move your vehicle so I can use my driveway." Without another word, she dialed 911. I stood there in stunned silence as she turned slightly away and began speaking loudly into the phone, her voice carrying across the quiet street. "Yes, I'm being threatened by a man in my neighborhood," she said dramatically. "He's yelling at me and acting aggressively." The narrative she constructed bore no resemblance to reality. Yet I knew from experience that once such claims enter official channels, they take on a life of their own. So I stepped back several feet, raising my hand slightly in a visible display of non-aggression, conscious of the fact that perception can become dangerously skewed when law enforcement arrives on a scene already primed with accusations. Within minutes, a patrol car turned onto the street, lights flashing but sirens silent. casting alternating red and blue reflections across the houses and drawing curious eyes to windows and doorways. And I felt the weight of public scrutiny settle over me as neighbors tried to decipher the situation from partial glimpses and whispered speculation. The officers stepped out and approached with measured caution, one heading toward me while the other walked toward her, and I kept my posture relaxed and my tone steady as I explained that I had returned home to find her vehicle blocking my driveway, that I had asked her politely to move it, and that she had responded by calling 911, offering my driver's license immediately to confirm my address and ownership of the property in question. Meanwhile, she spoke animatedly to the second officer, pointing in my direction and shaking her head emphatically. But the contrast between her theatrical indignation and my calm demeanor was stark, and it became clear fairly quickly that the situation was far less dramatic than she had implied. After verifying that the house and driveway belonged to me, one officer addressed her directly, saying in a firm but professional tone, "Ma'am, he has every right to ask you to move your vehicle from his driveway. Parking on someone else's property without permission can actually result in your car being towed." Her confident stance wavered slightly. "But he was yelling at me," she insisted. The officer turned to me. "Were you yelling, sir?" "No," I replied simply. "I asked her to move her car so I could use my driveway." The officer nodded and then returned his attention to her. "Calling 911 is for emergencies. This does not qualify as an emergency." The words seemed to deflate her resolve, and she muttered something under her breath before finally walking toward the SUV, unlocking it with an irritated press of the key fob and reversing out of my driveway abruptly, tires scraping faintly against the concrete as if even the vehicle itself shared her indignation. As she pulled away, the officers lingered briefly to ensure the situation had fully de-escalated, one of them advising her quietly about the proper use of emergency services, while the other reassured me that I had done nothing wrong. And when the patrol car eventually drove off, the neighborhood gradually returned to its prior calm, though the subtle undercurrent of gossip and judgment lingered in the air like the fading echo of sirens. I stood in my driveway for a moment, breathing deeply and letting the adrenaline dissipate, reflecting on how quickly a mundane request had spiraled into flashing lights and public spectacle. And I realized that the true conflict had not been about parking at all, but about entitlement, perception, and the unwillingness to accept boundaries when they are calmly asserted. Over the following days, I noticed that she avoided eye contact whenever we crossed paths, her earlier bravado replaced by a stiff, guarded demeanor. And although I felt a lingering irritation at her false accusations, I chose not to pursue further confrontation or retaliation, because the natural consequences of her actions had already unfolded in full view of the community. And in neighborhoods like ours, reputation has a quiet but lasting influence that no dramatic phone call can easily erase. Life gradually resumed its ordinary pace. The deck repair project was completed without further incident, and the driveway remained unobstructed from that day forward. Yet the memory of that afternoon stayed with me as a reminder of how fragile civility can be when filtered through defensiveness and ego, and how essential it is to remain composed even when confronted with exaggerated claims, because in the end, calm persistence and factual clarity carry more weight than theatrical indignation ever could. And what began as an inconvenience evolved into an unexpected lesson about boundaries, accountability, and the quiet strength required to stand firm in the face of misplaced authority.